Hello everyone, I'm ExtraCheesy87 and this is our Danganronpa 3 anime discussion video. This video has been kind of a long time in the making, and by that I mean I spent most of this morning and this afternoon writing bullet points for this video to guide this discussion. I didn't realize how much I had to say until I finished writing, and I finished with about 10 pages of bullet points, and a lot of these bullet points are more like mini paragraphs, so there's a lot to talk about. I do also want to thank myself for being bad at doing this intro, because I've recorded it like 2 different times, and it wasn't until the 3rd time that I realized that my mic was not being picked up by OBS because of a Windows update. That's cool. That's good. Thanks, Bill Gates. Wow, what a fucking nice thing to do to me. Just destroy my audio and make me almost record a 3-hour video without actually recording myself, which would have probably made me, like, actually in my life. So the setup for this video is essentially going to be 2 main parts, followed by a little capstone conclusion at the end. The background footage is just some random assorted gameplay from Prey, because I recorded like 10 videos of that thinking it was going to be the next Let's Play I was going to do, but that is put on temporary hold for now, since the new Let's Play is actually going to be Trails of Azure when that patch comes out later this month, and I need to keep a slot open for it. No like plot important stuff, it's all early game stuff with like no story, so there shouldn't be any spoilers or anything. Plus this is really more of like a one-man podcast type video, as opposed to like a full-on video essay. And with that said, I think we're just gonna kind of jump in. Alrighty, so overall, I enjoyed the anime, and I thought it was good. And I was kind of debating over how critical I wanted to be. Like, did I just want to be like, hey, it's good? Or did I really want to delve into and explore some of the problems I do have with the series? I've ultimately decided that we're going to get critical because I enjoy the franchise enough and I respect it enough in its storytelling to get critical when I think it makes mistakes, and I think the anime made some mistakes. We're going to start off talking about Future. We're just going to kind of run through the plot in semi-chronological order, talk about things that I thought were done well, things that I didn't think were done well. Then we move on to Despair. After we finish up Despair, we're going to talk about my biggest issue with the Despair arc and how I think it relates to the main theme of the series and why I think Despair makes a huge error. So, yeah, let's get it started. So Future arc, it has a bit of a slow start wherein you're bombarded with all these new characters, and honestly, I will admit, I had a bit of a hard time following it all. Like, honestly, most of, even the important characters, I didn't fully learn their names until I started writing bullet points for this video, and I had to look up every character's name and write them down. So at this point, I kind of know them all, at least the important new characters, because some of the new characters do very much just exist to die, so that there's an air of tension for the real characters that are actually important. Like, I mean, examples of that, like, really the, Pharmacy Lady, Seiko, Ruruka, Sonosuke, Daisuke, Great Gozu, like, they're just there to die. That's really their only importance for the plot. The Pharmacy girl, Sweets Lady, and Blacksmith, that trio does have like a bit of plot relevance, but like Daisuke and Great Gozu, they're just there to get freaking destroyed, so that to show you that the game is real and that there are some, actual consequences for it. They're there to build tension, basically. They're kind of throwaway characters. Which does kind of like, once you see that, it almost makes it hard to like really care that much about the new characters because you kind of see them as expendable. And while several of them are actually important, like Kyosuke, for example, him being kind of the pseudo main antagonist, for instance, and Ryota as well, are very important for the plot, you do kind of like wonder, like, are these guys just gonna like end up dying? At least for the first few episodes, that's kind of how I thought of them all. Is like, I feel like all the new characters are gonna die, which kind of almost happened, pretty much. So I found the setup for the game to be pretty interesting. Like, the forbidden action element in particular was a really cool idea. each character having their own specific thing they can't do that restricts them, was really interesting. And I feel like most of them were kind of cool and done well, like, you know, way that kind of like prolonged the game in a sense. Like, for example, the way it kind of kept Kyosuke under control, so he wasn't able to, like, once he goes full evil, he wasn't fully able to just wreak havoc, or Juzo not being able to use his punches as a boxer. So that, I mean, that was kind of neat. And then plus as well, like, some of the more plot relevant ones, like Kyoko's and Ryota's, were cool reveals. Or even the way it makes Makoto completely reliant on his friends, like the fact that he can't actually, for the most part, stand. I mean, granted, he's not really a fighter in the first place, but he's like even more reliant on his friends in the killing game, which was kind of neat because of his restriction. I do also really like that scene where Kyoko notices that the wall has changed. I did not notice it when I was originally watching it. I didn't really, I didn't notice that until they reveal it later on in the anime, when she specifically points out that, hey, the wall didn't have or that she noticed the wall didn't have the knife mark in it anymore, which I thought was really cool because they actually do kind of show that scene and her reacting to the wall in the second episode, which I just completely missed because I was probably too busy making a stupid joke while I was commentating over the anime. My only real potential problem with it is that if you were actually paying attention, I could see that kind of giving away the gimmick that it's a different building entirely, possibly. Like, I feel like you could probably have figured that out if you were kind of paying attention there, but it's not like a huge, like, major spoiler or anything, so even if you did figure it out, it wouldn't have been that big of a deal, but they were maybe a little on the nose, which is kind of, maybe I shouldn't say that considering I completely missed it, but I do feel like if you were paying attention, you definitely could have noticed that, because they do put a bit of an extra emphasis on Kyoko's reaction there. The Hina fake-out death at the end of episode 3, I didn't like, just because I don't like fake-out deaths. We'll talk about this more in depth a little bit later in the video, but I just think that fake-out deaths are kind of cheap, because you get all the emotional impact of a real character death without the actual consequences of killing off that character. The anime as a whole had like a lot of fight scenes in it, which I thought were very superfluous. I will say, while I didn't like most of them, mainly not because they were bad, but just because I feel like that screen time could have been better spent on other, like actually progressing the plot. The Kyosuke Tengen fight is actually really interesting, and there's some stuff to talk about there. Because it's got like I would say it's really the main fight scene with purpose in the entire anime. It's both a physical representation of the internal strife that the Future Foundation has, with kind of Tengen being not really like the old guard, because they're both like new members to it, but Kyosuke kind of has his own vision for the future, and Tengen has a conflicting vision, and their fight scene kind of represents that the Future Foundation is not really a cohesive individual or organization. And also, Kyosuke killing Tengen is important for two reasons. One, on like a storytelling sense, and the other kind of in like the thematic interestingness of it. So Kyosuke killing Tengen represents this like point of no return for his character. He basically, as soon as he kills Tengen, the viewer now sees him as a villain, instead of, because prior to that, really his only crime is that he's an asshole, which doesn't necessarily demand any moral retribution, because basically almost all fictional stories do follow some semblance of the karma system, wherein if characters do bad things, you kind of have to have bad things happen to them, because otherwise, since it's a fictional universe wherein the creator decides everything that happens, if you let bad guys get away with bad things forever, it almost comes as a endorsement of those actions. So once Kyosuke kills someone, he has to be punished later down the line, that he can never truly be a good guy again. Or at least that's kind of the implication of him killing Tengen. So another interesting part of the fight is that Kyosuke loses his eye in the process of killing Tengen, which on one hand you can look at it as that's just kind of like a physical example of him being wounded fighting Tengen, and it's also cool to have him be the one-eyed swordsman going around doing cool shit, but it also kind of has an interesting metaphorical impact, because him losing half of his eyesight there, it kind of represents how he's being blinded by his single-minded pursuit of Makoto. Like even later on in the anime, after he takes the drug and his other eye turns like black. On one hand, you could look at that and be like, oh, well, they just do that a lot just to... I mean, changing eye color is a very popular trope to represent like personality changes or corruption, and it's one that Danganronpa does use several times throughout the series, like with the red eyes on the Despair characters, or say like Chisa's weird swirly eyes, or Monica has like the Despair eyes as well, and several other characters throughout the series. But it also kind of like represents like his eyesight is kind of a metaphor for his own sanity, because as he becomes more and more obsessed with killing Makoto, he loses his eyesight, and he kind of fails to see the bigger picture. And I just thought that was kind of like an interesting aspect, or like an interesting bit of like visual storytelling there that I didn't kind of realize that theme there of Kyosuke's eyesight, because after, you know, he talks to Makoto towards the end of the arc, and Makoto is able to, you know, convince him with his talking powers, his eyes return to normal. He's kind of able to see clearly again and understand that his narrow-minded pursuit of his own version of hope was essentially indistinguishable from despair, that he was causing more harm than good by being so paranoid in regard to Makoto. So then you move on into probably the low point of the future arc, which is the storyline involving Seiko, Ruruka, and Sonosuke, which I really just didn't like. Not necessarily because it's bad, it's just that it takes up a ton of screen time. There's like 2.5 episodes dedicated to just the Seiko, Ruruka, and Sonosuke stuff, and it doesn't really contribute that much to the story, or the actual themes of the arc, or like the themes as a whole, and there's just not like a really ton of value to be gleaned from it. The anime itself doesn't really do anything with that conflict. The only value I was really able to find out of the sequences is that essentially the entire time that you're watching all that, you're just thinking about like, God, this Ruruka chick is just a piece of garbage. She's awful. I can't stand her. And so really the only value I was able to find out of that entire sequence is to represent that even the Future Foundation, the representation of hope and order in the new world, has individuals in it that still essentially act in evil and selfish ways. That, like, even though this is supposed to be the organization that's supposed to lead us into a better world, look at how selfish some of the members act, right? Where Ruruka treats Seiko like a piece of garbage for their entire friendship, and then manipulates Sonosuke into killing him in order to save herself. Like, she's just an awful, awful person. And I guess that's really the only kind of value I was able to find in that entire sequence. But even then, that point that like symbols of hope will commit bad things was kind of like already been proven earlier in the franchise. I mean, that's like the entire point of the first game. So I didn't really feel like that needed to be reiterated in your very limited amount of screen time. And I don't know. I just didn't really enjoy those three character storyline. I feel like it didn't add all that much. Then you get to the Ultra Despair Girls episode, which was neat, but still a little disappointing, at least with the way it ended. It kind of created the false impression in my mind at that point that like Monica was going to be a bigger deal and more important than she actually was. And ultimately they just kind of like hand wave her away and she disappears forever, pretty much, which was not really, I don't know, I almost kind of would have preferred her not showing up at all, rather than just showing up to be hand-waved away. I don't know, it just kind of felt a little half-baked, that entire sequence. It was definitely neat seeing the kind of, like, anime adaptation of the game, but the storyline itself of the episode was not that interesting to me. Kizakura's death it's probably the best well done death of all the side characters. For a few reasons. A, the scene itself is done just really well. And B, it actually has interesting implications on the main cast. Like, it represents, like, the conclusion of Kyoko's arc involving her father. Because the only reason Kizakura sacrifices himself for Kyoko is because of a promise he made to her dad, right? And Kyoko herself never, like, it's implied that she reconciles with her dad in the memories that she lost before they do the Hope Speak shelter event, because the fact that she's at Hope Speak and agrees to lock themselves in with him at the time kind of implies that there's some reconciliation there. But Kyoko herself doesn't have any memory of that. Really, the only proof she has that they got along is the picture that they find, that her and Makoto find on his desk, right? The picture of Kyoko's little girl. But even then, like, that's not as satisfying a conclusion as kind of knowing that Kizakura, I mean, because it's implied that Kyoko knows why Kizakura sacrificed himself, and it's because he's kind of not really repaying a debt, but, well, no, it's kind of the culmination of Jin repaying a debt that he owed Kyoko for not being in her life as she was growing up. Granted, it's not, it's presented as not being entirely his fault that he was kind of forced out of her life, but it's still definitely, like, sucks for all parties involved. But him being able to kind of, like, from the grave save her is, like, a really cool moment. Or that, like, you can kind of demonstrate that, like, Kizakura was so aware of Jin's love for Kyoko that he was willing to sacrifice himself for him. So that's a really, really good scene. Speaking of good scenes, I thought the Kyoko death scene is really well done. Like, the reasons for why she dies, dies is in air quotes here, is really well done, but the biggest central problem with it is that it was hard for me to fully care because I kind of knew they weren't going to commit to it, which is the problem with fake out deaths. It's the biggest, most central problem with fake out deaths in storylines is because once you do it once, you kind of violate your trust with the audience, and so then any later death scenes lack impact. Because in the back of your mind, you're just thinking, like, are they actually going to kill him off this time? Or is this going to be another fake out? Because I've already been tricked once, and I'm not going to let you trick me again. And so then, even when the death does end up being real, you don't really kind of realize it until later, and you don't have all that emotional impact in the moment as the death is revealed. And additionally, my problem with fake out deaths is that it's just kind of like lazy storytelling, because you get all the emotional impact of killing a character off with none of the consequences. Like, in my mind, a main character death should be a big deal, right? It should have, like, impact and repercussions on all the other characters in the series, and, well, not all the characters, but all the characters important to the dead character, and have implications on the plot itself. And so, killing off Kyoko just to kind of get that response, but then come back at the last second and be like, actually, she's alive. Haha, gotcha. I just didn't like it. And it undermined that scene because the whole time I'm like, I don't think they're actually killing her off. So, I don't know. That's why I don't like fake out deaths. And granted, the game, or the series as a whole, isn't that guilty of doing it. Well, actually, that's not true. Because, I mean, major fake out deaths are like, Danganronpa 1 doesn't really have any. I mean, kind of with Makoto in Chapter 5, but I don't really count that as a fake out death. Danganronpa 2 has the one with Neko, and then technically at the end of the anime, when they bring back all the the dead members of the Danganronpa 2 crew, that's kind of a fake out death in my mind. At least they do imply that they're not actually dead forever, and there is a way to bring them back, even if they never actually explain that. And there is the Hina fake out death in the start of the future arc, which was kind of why I was like, if they can't even kill off Hina, they're not killing off Kyoko. Was kind of the way I thought about it. So the final Kyosuke Makoto confrontation is also really well done, like with the extra, like Makoto having that extra fire in him after Kyoko dies for him, like dies for his own ideals essentially. Is really well done, and I also liked the in-universe explanation for why Kyosuke couldn't just instantly kill Makoto and had to sit there and listen to his friendship speech. That was kind of neat that like Makoto was able to figure out his essential weakness and back him into a situation where he had to listen to him talk. Was pretty cool. And also, once again, that connects back to the thing I said about Kyosuke's eyes. Like, after they finish talking, Kyosuke's eyes turn back to normal, and it represents that kind of fog of despair clearing over him so that he can see clearly again and isn't so consumed by this fear that Makoto is evil and might destroy the new world that he's worked so hard to build at the cost of his friends. The reveal of the suicide being the killer was pretty good. Like, it's neat, but it kind of just reminds me how much I dislike the brainwashing aspect that the Despair arc establishes, which we'll talk about at length later in the video, so I'm not going to get into it right here. But overall, I thought the suicide stuff was kind of a cool little explanation, but I just hate brainwashing, man. Which we'll talk about for a long time later on. Juzo's redemption was really well done. I quite like that whole scene where, Kyosuke's running after he realizes that Juzo wasn't actually corrupted. He just kind of made a mistake. And, running with the music and everything to see Juzo one last time before he dies is like a really, really good scene. I didn't really like Tengen being the quote-unquote villain at the end, where it was revealed that he was the one who organized the entire game. Because really, I had been under the impression that Kyosuke was the mastermind, which made a lot more sense to me and was more compelling as a whole. Because Kyosuke, there's a lot of time spent on Kyosuke across Future and Despair, like, fleshing out his ideology and his just characterization is a lot deeper, so you can kind of understand his actions and motives. And I also kind of wish that Kyosuke had been presented more as, instead of thinking Makoto was already evil, he was scared more of the idea that Makoto could be corrupted. Because since Chisa was corrupted and he believed his other best friend Juzo to be corrupted, that he was kind of the opinion that anybody but himself could fall victim, and so he couldn't trust Makoto to be the one to lead the new world, so to speak, because if Makoto did get turned, he could cause untold havoc because he's such a smooth talker. And so I kind of thought the game was basically just an elaborate setup for Kyosuke to eliminate Makoto, and also clear the way for him to take over full control of the Future Foundation, because he's just so untrusting of everyone else, knowing that, his two closest companions were corrupted. Like, if they were corrupted, how can he trust anyone else? So that kind of made sense to me. And instead, it just being that Tengen didn't trust humanity to recover naturally, and instead, they needed to be brainwashed back to normality. Like, it's an okay explanation that I could kind of buy, but the anime itself doesn't really explore Tengen's thoughts and motivations. Not to the same degree that they explore Kyosuke's, like his ideology. And so, what caused Tengen to make such that radical decision that humanity can't be trusted and needs to be controlled? They can't be, that, like, just in the way that brainwash them got them in a situation, it's the only way to get them out. Like, I mean, it's an understandable viewpoint, but I do wish there had been some kind of scenes where Tengen got to talk about why he thought that, or you could kind of see scenes wherein he became less trusting of humanity's own self-reliance. So I do kind of dislike that angle of it, even though I will admit that I kind of I enjoyed that, like, the final villain, like, you know, the final villain of the anime is essentially Ryota, who, he's not really the villain, but, like, adversary, maybe is the better way to put it, that he's kind of just, like, a misguided individual, that he still wants to better the world, but he just kind of has a different idea how to do it. He kind of has more trauma from the tragedy than, say, someone like Makoto, and so therefore he just inherently has a more harsh view of society, and also his own kind of personal guilt over feeling like he's the one who caused the entire situation to spin out of control, and therefore he wants to be the one to fix things, so to speak. So, like, I did enjoy that. It's just really the Tengen stuff at the end. I wasn't really, it's not that I didn't like it, I just thought it could have been fleshed out more. And another thing that I wanted to kind of talk about in Kyosuke in regard, before we kind of wrap up our discussion of Future, is that it kind of fits in with one of the themes of the series, is that, like, hope and despair are kind of indistinguishable at times. I think that's kind of like the, you know, the main purpose of, like, Nagito's character is to kind of explore that idea that these concepts are not necessarily that different. There's only a thin line in between them. And so Kyosuke, in his pursuit of hope, of, like, ensuring that the world is able to recover by eliminating any potential threats that could be corrupted, so him being, like, the final villain of the series, so to speak, was, like, really fit in with that thematically, where his actions are essentially indistinguishable from any of the other villains, like Junko. Like, he's captured a bunch of people and plans to kill them all, and while he does have a noble goal in mind, and his reasons for doing so are kind of understandable, he's still doing evil actions. So that's kind of why, like, I would have preferred it being Kyosuke being the mastermind who set everything up. Just because it kind of, like, made more sense. He's got more screen time and fleshing out of his viewpoints and storyline and backstory. He's just, like, a more important character than Tengen. So it made more sense to me for him to be the actual big bad, so to speak. I think we're actually going to we're going to pause and not do Despair. I think earlier I said we were going to do Future, Despair, then Hope. Instead, we're going to jump to Hope, because Despair leads directly into the kind of meat of the video, so to speak. So we're just going to kind of, and plus, you know, Hope kind of, you know, flows right out of Future. Overall, I feel like Hope is good, but it's a little too rushed. The fact that it's only, like, one, you know, 20-minute episode, or, like, 22-minute episode or something like that, holds it back, but I do still think it's a fairly satisfying conclusion, even though there are a couple missteps here and there. I do really like the idea that the ones to ultimately save the day are the ultimate despairs. That's a really cool plot point. And the way it kind of vindicates that Makoto was right to... that, like, Makoto's more forgiving stance is kind of the right thing, because that's the only thing that was able to save the day in the end, was because he chose to forgive earlier on, and that it's kind of a rebuke of Kyosuke's more iron-handed ideology. I do have to say, though, that it does kind of suck that there's no explanation for the ultimate despairs being brought back, or even just, like, a scene showing Izuru working on saving them. Like, just a little bit would have been nice. I would have definitely loved to have seen, like, a scene that, like, takes place immediately after Danganronpa 2, not really ended, but that shows them waking up from the pods for the first time, and kind of the aftermath of realizing that they're different people now, so to speak, or like, you know, they're, or, you know, and it kind of would have also explained the thing with like Izuru and Hajime, which I felt was like very unclear to me. Like that Izuru is still Izuru, he just chooses to act like Hajime instead of it being that Hajime from the computer takes over his own body again. That whole sequence is like a little unclear and confusing to me. And a scene that kind of clearly established what actually happens after they wake up from the video game or the VR Neo World program would have been greatly appreciated. In general, I just didn't really like how the Danganronpa 2 crew just kind of shows up at the last second all alive. Even though, I mean, the actual scene itself, where they're able to convince Ryota to give humanity another chance, is really good. It would have been nice to kind of have a little bit of build-up in regarding that. The scene where, like, as, you know, Makoto is running up the stairs and he sees that Izuru/Hajime is already talking to Ryota with the ultimate despairs is really good. Like, the way he's just kind of able to stop and silently watch as his decision to choose forgiveness and rehabilitation actually pays off. That's, like, really well done. And one of my favorite scenes of the whole anime. Izuru's final speech is also really good. And just that whole sequence, it just feels nice. I don't really know how to like go into more detail in regard, but I just liked it. I also really enjoyed Nagito fanboying out over Makoto when he sees them, especially since my initial theory when I was playing through Danganronpa 2 was that Nagito was someone who watched the events of Danganronpa 1 on TV and then became obsessed with Makoto, which is why he, you know, sounds like him, acts like him, calls himself the Ultimate Hope, things like that. Or he doesn't call himself the Ultimate Hope, but, you know, has that obsession with Hope. Now, ultimately, that's not really the explanation, but I really liked that idea when I was playing through Danganronpa 2, at least until it was kind of, you got to the point where you're like, yeah, that's not really a viable theory anymore. So Nagito being a fanboy of Makoto, though, was definitely neat, and I enjoyed that. So I was like a little worried that they were going to bring Chiake back when you had that scene where Hajime is talking to what appears to be her before it's revealed that it's kind of just like a figment of his imagination. Because while I can get over Kyoko being brought back, if Chiake had been brought back, I would have been like actually pretty mad. Just because her death is so important for the overall series, and even Hajime/Izuru's character. Like, it's kind of very much implied that them being so impacted by Chiake's death is kind of why the Neo World program was able to work, because there was that central figure that was kind of able to anchor them and get their personalities back to what they were prior to becoming Ultimate Despairs. And also, I mean, just her death being the impetus for them becoming Ultimate Despairs in the first place, and it kind of giving Izuru some, like, kind of him experiencing humanity for the first time, like, as he watches her die, and kind of is in shock at her resilience even in death. So if they had brought back Chiake, I would have been like really mad, because that's like an example of how deaths should be important. Like, they should be kind of permanent and have meaning to them. And I am really glad that they committed to keeping Chiake dead, because they could have easily just been like, she's alive too because of reasons at that point, and I'm glad they didn't do that. Didn't really like the reveal of Kyoko's death being a fake out. I think if the show had ended with a funeral scene for Kyoko with all the original cast, that would have actually been a really powerful scene, and it would have driven home the kind of themes of the series as a whole. That, like, it's about, like, in a lot of ways, the series is about moving on past adversity or tragedy. It's about not dwelling in the past and always moving forward with the memories of what has happened, right? And so honoring Kyoko's death and sacrifice while also looking forward to a brighter future would have been, I think, a better ending as a whole. then the way they present it, where they're kind of, and it's similar-ish in a way where you have Makoto on like the third floor of Hope's Peak looking down at the world, at kind of like the new world, because really all the games in the anime in the same, they all kind of have like optimistic is probably the word I would use to describe them. Like Danganronpa 1 ends with this feeling that the worst is behind them. You know, the whole gang is standing in front of the vault door as it opens, and there's the hope that on the other side, you know, regardless of whatever is out there, it's better than being stuck in Hope's Peak and doomed to die alone. There's at least the chance of kind of something better out there. Danganronpa 2 kind of ends the same way, with Hajime/Izuru looking out over the ocean and thinking about how he can create his own future now, right? That there's a better world to be made. Ultra Despair Girls also ends in the same way, with the painting shot of the city to show that, like, everything's destroyed, but it's now a bright day. Things can only go up from here. Like, there's optimism to all those endings. That's also tinged with sadness, right? Because with Danganronpa 1's ending, you pretty much know that the outside world is probably fucked. With Danganronpa 2, you don't know if they're going to be able to bring back everyone who died. With Ultra Despair Girls, there's still the ongoing conflict between the Monokumas and the adults and everything. And plus, Toko and Komaru are kind of trapped in the city. So I wouldn't say any of the games have like a happy ending. And because of that, I would actually say that even though, or like I would say the games actually have surprisingly happy endings. Not like fully happy, but like kind of optimistic. And so I would say the anime's more, like, I mean, it has a happier ending than any of the main games, but it's still actually fairly in line with the games itself, being a fairly optimistic, like, hey, things are still kind of bad, but they're only going to get better from here. Because, I mean, even look at, like, you know, because, I mean, at the end of the anime, the world is still kind of fucked. Like, it's recovering, but, I mean, still countless people have died. Hajime and friends have taken the blame for destroying the Future Foundation. They're essentially going to be in exile forever and never able to integrate back into society. They have themselves, but that's it. Their families have been, I mean, they killed their families, as is implied in Danganronpa 2. Or not really implied, like straight up stated, that they killed their families and countless others. They kind of have to live with their sins. Now, granted, it's part of the reason why I hate brainwashing, because technically they never did anything wrong, and I feel like that undermines stuff, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. Or it undermines the impact of them being ultimate despairs. Kyosuke is left alone in the world, and he kind of has to come to terms with the consequences of his actions and atone for them. He has to kind of go around and find what meaning there is still left in living, right? So, like, basically everyone but Makoto has kind of a honestly sad ending, right? Or somewhat sad. And I think, like, the idea that the ending is a happily ever after is a bit of a misnomer, even though it does kind of, like, just because Makoto's seen as last, I guess it feels happier than it kind of is. And even, you know, with Hajime and friends on the boat, it's still, like, a very optimistic vibe. Even though, if you think about it, I mean, being stuck on a boat forever and never really able to integrate back into society because you've been forced to take the blame for horrible crimes, kind of sucks. But so overall, definitely the happiest of the endings, but overall, I would still say it's more optimistic about the future than an actual, like, happily ever after ending, which is in line with the endings of the other games. So now let's talk about Despair Arc. Let's backtrack to Despair Arc. Oh boy, I got a lot to say, basically. Despair Arc is kind of funny to me, because when I was watching the anime, it was the one I was, like, looking forward to watching the most. Like, every time we would finish watching a future episode, I was excited to see the next Despair Arc episode. And, ultimately, I don't know how to, I'm trying to think how to phrase it. You know, let's just start from the beginning and work through. So I think Despair starts off pretty strong. I enjoyed the first 2 episodes being kind of like a really lighthearted slice of life approach. That was kind of like neat and fun and definitely like enjoyable. But there's also that kind of like odd sense of foreboding to it all, since as the audience kind of already knows that the story ends poorly for everyone involved. So it's kind of it's a weird feeling, right? Where you're kind of like, I'm enjoying this, but I also know that it's not going to last. So it's kind of novel in that sense. I do like the idea that Chiake was a real person. That's like a cool, I'm going to use the phrase retcon, and I don't mean that like in a negative sense, but I mean, it essentially is kind of like the dictionary definition of a retcon. But I think it's actually a good one, because it creates like interesting questions in the viewer's mind about what exactly is going to happen to Chiake, because having the knowledge of what happens in Danganronpa 2, and that she's not a real person in that game, you kind of know that she doesn't make it out of the anime alive. You can, like, heavily assume that, and really you're just kind of wondering, like, how exactly does it all go down? And so it's kind of like almost a bittersweet like reunion with the character, where you're like, oh, it's cool to see the character again, but you also know that something horrible is gonna happen to them eventually. Also, one of the reasons why I like Chiake being a real person is the idea that her and Hajime had like a friendship in real life was cool, because A, it adds retroactive meaning to their like friendship and relationship in Danganronpa 2. And it also, the way it provides an explanation for why Hajime chose to go through with the Kamakura project is really cool. Because really, like, it's way more interesting to me that Hajime's kind of inferiority complex was fueled by this desire to, like, fit in with one of his friends who's an ultimate and actually be able to impress her, is a little bit more interesting than it's just that Hajime kind of has like an inferiority complex, that it's kind of a mixture of the two, is cool. And also the way they do the Kamakura project, where it's implied that Hajime doesn't know it's going to wipe out his personality, because he kind of talks about right before he makes the decision to, enroll himself in the project, he talks about how he wants to be able to like hold up his head high around Chiake and not be like kind of an embarrassment around her. So that kind of leads to the implication that he still thinks he's going to have his memories and be able to, come back after the operation and impress Chiake and everything. Whereas it's also, it's revealed that the organization themselves know that Hajime's mind is going to be wiped, because there's that line about where one of the characters says, like, they weren't sure about Hajime as a candidate because they found him indecisive. And then one of the other science guys is like, oh, well, don't worry, his entire personality has been erased as planned, or something along those lines. So it was like they knew, and they kind of lied to Hajime, so it makes him an even more, like, sympathetic figure. Another thing, this is kind of backtracking slightly, I didn't really like the way they handled the death of Fuyuhiko's sister. Not that it was bad, it's just a missed opportunity, which is really, it's a phrase you're going to hear a lot as we talk about this. There's a lot of missed opportunities in Despair Arc. I feel like Fuyuhiko's sister's death, I can't remember her name, I think it's Naomi? I want to say it's Naomi, but I can't fully remember, so I'm probably just going to call her Fuyuhiko's sister. I feel like that should have been a very pivotal and important moment in the arc, and really it's not. Like, even just the impact of her death and Sato's death on Fuyuhiko and Mahiru respectively is never really fully explored. Like, they kind of imply that the class is, like, bummed about the whole thing, which is why Nagito tries to cancel the exams, but you never really see any scenes of Fuyuhiko being, like, devastated or Mahiru being devastated, because I feel like both of that event should have been the foundation for both of them becoming ultimate despairs, right? Because they're kind of in trauma over it. And then I also think that murder of Sato in particular could have been an interesting part to create division in the class. Like maybe if, say, certain, like maybe Mahiru suspected Fuyuhiko of being the killer. I mean, granted, they don't ever really imply exactly how the Sato stuff goes down, but like I'm still under the assumption that Fuyuhiko's not actually the one that kills Sato, that it's Peko. That Fuyuhiko wants to kill Sato, but it's kind of plays out, it kind of mirrors the way it happens in Danganronpa 2, where Fuyuhiko wants to kill Sato, but doesn't quite actually have the resolve to do it, and Peko steps in to do it for him, to A, fulfill his will, and also for plausible deniability, because, you know, she's supposed to be his protector, right? So if she kills Sato, then if it ever gets figured out, she can take the fall for it, as opposed to Fuyuhiko. But, which granted, that's not really important or anything, but I just kind of like, I thought that could have been kind of neat if that had been the first domino that led to a more natural corruption of the class, which is kind of what I was expecting to happen. That, like, say, Mahiru, you know, suspects Fuyuhiko, and certain members side with Fuyuhiko, certain members of the class believe Mahiru, and that kind of creates division, and the idea of them all being, like, one cohesive group is, like, slowly eroded. And it kind of like splits the group up, therefore, which allows for Junko to kind of move in and slowly start to corrupt them. But, you know, the anime does not even begin to go in that route, which sucks, as we'll talk about. Another thing I really didn't like Mukuro's characterization at all. Not only did I find her annoying, I found it contradicted what little established characterization she got in the first game. I mean, she really only has, like, a few lines that I feel like are her true personality. Like, right before she's killed, you can kind of tell that she becomes, like, more gruffer and aggressive as she kind of, after, you know, they explain the thing about, I can't really remember exactly how it happens up to the lead-up of her death, but when she, you know, starts attacking Monokuma, right? Like, that was, to me, the implication there was that was Mukuro's real personality, as she kind of broke character as pretending to be Junko, with the, because the implication there is that Mukuro was tricked by Junko into, getting killed to establish, like, fear in the minds of everyone else, that, like, hey, don't break the rules or else, that kind of situation. And so Mukuro being this, like, super submissive, servient, lovey-dovey character towards Junko, I just didn't really like. I just felt like it clashed with that characterization, that very small glimpse we see into her true personality into the first game. And it also, like, they didn't really explain, like, why Mukuro is so obsessed with Junko at all. Like, I kind of expected it to be like Mukuro and Junko, like, hated each other, but they work together because they kind of have the same end goal of spreading despair, which I thought would have been actually, like, more entertaining if it was like they hated each other's guts, but they were forced to put up with each other. That kind of situation. And so Mukuro being this, like, very meek character, and it kind of clashed also with the idea of her being, like, a child soldier. Like, you can almost expect her to be more, like, gruff and aggressive, kind of like how she's portrayed very shortly in that scene right before her death in Danganronpa 1. I also kind of felt like the entire arc was missed an opportunity when it came to Junko. Like, I've been very vocal as I've played through the games that, like, I don't really find Junko to be a compelling villain. And this arc actually provided a good chance for Junko to flex her evil mastermind abilities, and she doesn't really do that. For how much the series constantly talks about how, like, amazing Junko is and how she's able to manipulate people and do all this social engineering, she really doesn't do very much in the anime itself. Like, she does a lot of evil stuff, yes, but her methods are, like, relatively crude, and it's very much implied that the main reason she's so successful in, like, killing members of Hope's Peak and going around, like, undetected, so to speak, is because Hope's Peak itself is incompetent and is trying to, like, cover up these deaths instead of investigating them properly. Because, I mean, as evidenced by Juzo and Chisa are able to figure out that, Junko was the one going around killing people. And, she does have that one scene where she kind of blackmails Juzo, which is kind of okay. I mean, it's an okay amount of, like, manipulation, right? I do have some problems with that scene, but we'll talk about that in a second when we get to it. But, trying to think if there was anything else. But yeah, it just kind of felt like more like it was portrayed less that Junko is so unbelievably cunning that she's able to manipulate everyone, and more that she's kind of just, like, only successful out of A, luck in finding Ryota, and B, because Hope's Peak itself is incompetent, which isn't necessarily bad, because the idea that, that can be like a decent bit of storytelling that, like, Hope's Peak's own arrogance and incompetence resulted in their destruction, which is kind of cool. But because they constantly talk about how cunning Junko is, I would have liked to have seen more of that, right? Like, even her corruption of Izuru isn't really anything she does. Izuru comes pre-corrupted, and that's another missed opportunity, I think. I feel like what it would have been cooler is if Izuru had actually kind of been the ultimate hope, and it was Junko's actions that corrupted him and, like, crushed his faith in humanity. Like, that would have been way more compelling than Izuru already, like, not caring about humanity and essentially just kind of following Junko along because he's bored. Like, I think the student council murder scene in particular had a ton of potential, like, for Izuru's downfall. Like, instead of it being like the student council murder scene essentially just happens to show Izuru something interesting so he'll follow along with Junko's plans. Like, imagine if, say, Junko met Izuru, and Izuru has such this, like, overwhelming confidence and hope and like faith in humanity that being shown the student council murder sequence actually, like, crushes him and his worldview, and then from there he's able to be corrupted. That would have been, like, a really cool scene that adds extra meaning to the student council murder scene, in that it's the event that radicalizes Izuru, and it also makes Junko look like a compelling villain and mastermind, because look at the way she's able to mentally crush Hope's Peak's ultimate hope. And him just being evil right from the start very much kind of lessens that impact, right? We're not going to go into it too much in detail yet, because it's really, we talk about this mostly in the next section, but then they introduce the brainwashing stuff with, Chisa and Mikan, which did not like. Hated it, actually. I went from, like, I don't think I like this, to I absolutely hate it. With time, as I've thought about it more and more. But, well, like I said, we got a whole section in regard to brainwashing and why it was a bad idea. Nagito trying to kill Junko was actually really interesting. And kind of like, that's one thing that I will say about Nagito, is I feel like he was kind of softened in the spare arc, because in Danganronpa 2, it's established that he's kind of morally questionable even before any influence from Junko, right? Like, his default personality, he's ready to kill one of the members as soon as the killing game starts, just because of his weird warped view that Hope would rise up from within the other members if he put them in a perilous situation by killing one of their own. So it's kind of weird to see him way more, like, nice and calm throughout it all. But him trying to kill Junko was kind of like an example of his ability to kind of do the wrong thing for the right reason, so to speak. I don't even know if that's not the way I want to phrase it, but to do actions that others wouldn't be willing to do, I suppose. Because I think killing Junko in that situation by that point is, like, unambiguously a good thing, considering by then she's already murdered, like, tons of people throughout campus. But I do just kind of, because I mean, Nagito comes across as like a bit more like unambiguously like a villain in Danganronpa 2, whereas in Despair, he's portrayed way more like kind of, not really sympathetic, but he's more like he's softened, I guess, is the way I would phrase it. You don't really see much of his kind of warped views of society or anything, and it's played up like his devotion to hope is more of kind of like used as a joke rather than the kind of disturbing way it's portrayed in Danganronpa 2, if that makes any sense. Oh yeah, and I did like the little fight scene, so to speak, between Izuru and Nagito, even if it is a little cornball when Izuru's all like, "Oh, you have luck? I have luck too!" And then he, teleports behind him, nothing personnel, kid. It's a little corny, but still kind of entertaining, I'll have to admit. Also, Chiake's capture and torture sequence is really well done. It's like pretty harrowing. As while I don't really like the brainwashing aspect, the forcing all of the Danganronpa 2 crew to watch as Chiake is slowly killed is a impactful scene, I'll say. And the scene between Chiake and Izuru as Chiake's dying, and she's demonstrating this kind of like ultimate resolve in the face of death. It's the best scene in the Despair arc and probably the saddest moment in all of the series, as she, kind of manages to get through to Izuru, even though he doesn't really understand why he's affected, and just her, like, complete and total resolve despite all the shit that's gone down. While I do have many problems with the Despair arc, that scene is very good. And I don't know if I'd say it's worth the price of admission, but it's quite a powerful little sequence. Another thing, like, with the brainwashing, like a little minor issue, not my major issue that we'll talk about for about 4 hours as I keep talking about it, or keep mentioning it, I didn't, like, they never really explain why the Danganronpa 2 crew is so fanatically loyal and devoted to Junko, considering none of them ever meet Junko or interact with her, with the exception of Mikan, who sees her like a couple times, and Nagito, who talks to her for about 60 seconds. Everyone else never meets her, and the only reason they would even know who she is because she shows up in the Chiake torture video, wherein you would kind of think that they would hate Junko because of that, because they watched as she, tortured and killed their best friend, or like, one of their close companions, so to speak. So I just, they didn't really ever explain that, why they're so, like, fanatically loyal as is demonstrated in Danganronpa 2. Another aspect that I did kind of enjoy about the Despair arc was the extra context it gave Kyosuke's actions for future arc, where you can see that he believes Juzo has betrayed him, and he knows eventually that Chisa has also been corrupted. So it's kind of interesting how that explains some of his more drastic actions in the future arc, and why he is so distrustful of Makoto, because he's kind of been conditioned to believe that he can never trust anyone, right? That his two closest companions were corrupted. Why should this Makoto kid, who is nowhere near as strong as Juzo and Chisa, how would he be able to resist the corruption? Or, like, that's his viewpoint of Makoto. He seems very, like, disdainful towards him in the beginning, but I do also have to say, coming back to the Juzo betrayal scene, where, he lies about Junko being innocent, I don't know. I do think it's kind of odd that it's established that Juzo kind of has this, like, real love for Kyosuke, and that, like, if he loved him that much, like, wouldn't he rather sacrifice that relationship than betray the man that he cares for? Like, that's way worse than, like, I mean, I don't, it's like, it's such a selfish action, right? And it kind of hurts Juzo's likability. it's like, I mean, I understand where they're coming from, right? He doesn't want to sacrifice like his most important relationship because he's scared that Kyosuke might end up hating him if it came out that he had like romantic feelings for him, because he doesn't know how Kyosuke thinks in that regard, right? But at the end of the day, if you were like, oh, why did you kill all these people? Well, it was because if my crush found out that I liked them and they ended up hating me, I'd be really sad about it. Like, that's not a good defense. And of course, it's a little bit more complicated when you get into the, homophobia and stuff like that. That's not really directly confronted, but, it's kind of implied that there would be bigger repercussions if Juzo was outed, right? Potentially. But still, it's kind of like, I feel like Juzo definitely shouldn't have sold out humanity just because he didn't want his best friend to hate him, potentially, on like the very off chance that he would have hated him or been like offended by it. So, I don't know. That was a little... I just feel like it made Juzo less likable, I guess. Like, I don't really know how much it accomplished. It is important for Kyosuke's character arc, because him thinking that Juzo is also corrupted is important for him being so distrustful, but I just feel like the reason Juzo betrayed Kyosuke is a little thin. But overall, I've had to sum up the Despair arc. It's an arc that had so much potential, and it squandered almost all of it. I think the really only unambiguously positive thing it did is all the stuff with Chiake was well done. Her scenes with Hajime in the beginning of the anime, and her death at the end. Everything else was just misstep after misstep and missed opportunity after missed opportunity. It failed to answer the most interesting question, that like the reason the Despair arc exists is to answer the question of how the Danganronpa 2 crew got corrupted, right? That's the main reason it exists. Additionally, explaining how the actual tragedy went down at Hope's Peak. And I just don't think it offers good answers to those questions. It opts to use the cheap cop-out of brainwashing, which is uninteresting from a story perspective, and it kind of goes against one of the pre-established notions of the series, was that people can be corrupted naturally if they're put in a bad enough situation. Which is what we're going to get into the next section of the video, which is a more thematic English lit major section, so to speak. We're getting into critical analysis of basically the entire series, of what I find to be the most important theme of the series, which is choice. The theme of choice is probably the most essential part of the Danganronpa series as a whole, and constantly shows up again and again throughout the series. Like, the essential question of the first game, and really the premise for the series, is that, or whether or not individuals would choose to prioritize a larger group or themselves when put into desperate situations. Junko's whole thesis behind her killing game in the first game is that these symbols of hope will ultimately choose to prioritize themselves and their own well-being over the good of the group. And the group in this case is kind of a metaphor for society as a whole. That no matter how good and upstanding a person you are, when you're put into the right situation, Junko believes that person will always prioritize themselves over other people, right? She doesn't really believe in the idea of, like, self-sacrifice, so to speak. And in this sense that, like, she sees hope as unnatural, and that people are essentially like primal beings that are defined by despair. Now, in this case, I think of hope as being representative as, this may not be the best word, but collectivism, and despair is individualism. Like, Junko's idea behind despair essentially seems to be that people should do what they want because, like, whatever benefits them, right? Because they want to do it. It doesn't really matter how your actions affect other people, it only matters how it makes you feel and how it benefits you. And so when put into these, right situations, every person will eventually choose to embrace despair in order to survive. They will embrace their own innate instinct for self-preservation. Which is why the correct decision in the killing games is to always trust your fellow captives and work together. In this sense, it's kind of a complicated version of the prisoner's dilemma, where the correct thing to do is to always trust everyone else and not get caught up on worrying about whether or not you're going to get betrayed, because if you worry too much about getting betrayed, you just end up screwing everyone in the long run. But because Junko is out to prove that everyone can be corrupted, the whole game is built upon the idea of choice. It's not about just killing these symbols of hope, right? It's about putting these symbols of hope in a situation where they choose to kill each other. That's what gives the killing game impact. Like, wanton murder doesn't really accomplish the goal she wants. She wants to prove that people are innately selfish, right? And so, because of that, all the motives in the first game incentivize killing, but never force them to happen. And that's pretty much true for Danganronpa 2, with one exception. So every death in Danganronpa 1 is the result of an active choice, right? No one is ever forced to do anything against their will. The choice to not kill is always there. It's kind of an interesting and compelling premise that demonstrates people's own desire for self-preservation. And it also shows how humans have this kind of ability to disregard the value of others' lives when it helps keep us alive, right? And in that sense, the killing game is actually kind of set up in a way to make killing more difficult due to the killing rule, wherein that if you execute the wrong person, then everyone dies, right? So the only way to get out of the situation and win, so to speak, is to kill everyone in the long run. Like, when you choose to make that one kill, you're not just killing one person, you're killing every other survivor at once, right? There's no such thing as kind of a justified or reasonable killing, because even if the one person you kill maybe deserves it, or you have a reason for wanting to kill them, unless you come out and instantly out yourself as the killer, you're condemning every other survivor in the process, which kind of makes it, when those characters choose to kill, all that more impactful, because it's a mass murder, right? It's the difference between a crime of passion and, say, a school shooting or like a mass shooting event, right? There's a fundamental difference in psychology that goes into both of those crimes, right? And it makes that decision of these characters to kill all the more impactful. And in a way, harder to do, because it's easier to convince yourself, hey, maybe this one person is like just a bad person, and I can kill them. Maybe they deserve it. You can kind of trick yourself into thinking that, but it's harder to do that when you're killing everyone else at once when you make that murder, right? So in that sense, like, the killing game somewhat disincentivizes killing, like, psychologically speaking. And the fact that it's never forced, it's that choice is underlined by the killing rule, right? And it's also fitting that Junko's final living act, is to offer Makoto and his friends a choice. Do you embrace the gilded cage of Hope's Peak, or gamble that everything she said is a lie? Do you trust in your own faith that society wouldn't crumble that easily? Or do you take the easy choice to value your own life, value your own self-preservation, and stay in Hope's Peak? It's kind of an interesting question that it plays on the human psychology in the same way that, like, game shows like Let's Make a Deal do, where you have this guaranteed thing of life and safety in Hope's Peak, or you have the gamble of the outside world, which could either be exactly the same as you remember it, or far, far worse. And I've kind of like in the past maybe joked a little bit about how Junko's final proposition doesn't make sense. Like, why would you ever want to stay in Hope's Peak? But it kind of like makes sense. It's an interesting test on how much faith the characters have that society is too strong to have crumbled in 2 years, right? Or how much do you even want to believe this crazy woman, right? Because like what she says seems so unbelievably improbable that it's hard to accept. And all the characters, it's implied that they still have like a faith and a hope that the outside world is still going to be okay, fundamentally, that it was all kind of a lie, that society's not that fragile. When really that's kind of Junko's whole MO, is to prove that society is that fragile. But she does it by offering a choice. You know, she never forces them out to, you know, experience that and see the moment that their realities are crushed. She lets them make their own decision, right? Now, choice isn't quite as important in Danganronpa 2 because Chapter 3 is bad, but it's still an important part in the overall story. Because every motive, aside from the one in Chapter 3, where Mikan was turned evil because of a disease, lol, there's always a choice in making a killing, right? Chapter 1, I don't actually think there's a motive in Chapter 1 from what I remember. Chapter 2 has the thing with Fuyuhiko, where AI Junko has that knowledge of Fuyuhiko to know how he's going to act. Like, she's reasonably sure that Fuyuhiko is going to kill Mahiru, or at the very least get Peko to kill Mahiru for him, because she kind of already knows how that happened in the Sato case, where, I mean, it's always like left ambiguous as to whether or not Fuyuhiko or Peko killed Sato. I kind of choose to believe that Peko was the one who actually killed Fuyuhiko, or killed Sato, because Fuyuhiko wanted to do it, but he couldn't quite bring himself to do it, and so then Peko came in for to fulfill his wishes, because she's like brainwashed into being subservient to him, and also it gives extra plausible deniability from like a legal standpoint, where it's like, oh, Fuyuhiko didn't do it, Peko did it, so if it were ever found out, she would be the one to accept the consequences for the murder. But so once again, like, Fuyuhiko is offered that choice to kill Mahiru, but he's never forced into doing it. You know, Junko has reasonable like assurances that he's going to do it, but at any time, Fuyuhiko had the option to not kill Mahiru, right? And Chapter 4, which has also kind of a rigged motive where a killing is forced or a death is forced, it's still implied, right? That just due to the way the rules work, where any death that's not due to illness counts as a killing, self-sacrifice, aka suicide, is always an option to save the group, right? Like, each character is given that choice of, do I sacrifice myself and ensure that this section of the killing game ends and that everyone's able to eat again and escape from the funhouse? Or do I wait and hope someone else is killed? Or do I go out and kill someone myself and, you know, take my future into my own hands, right? So even when the game is completely, like, rigged to force a death, there is still an aspect of choice for the killing, right? Like, they're not forced to kill anyone in that chapter. Someone has to die, but it doesn't have to be a murder, right? Like, you don't have to be the one to kill anyone. And Chapter 5 also has an important choice when it comes to what do you do with Chiake. Do you sacrifice the individual who has actually done nothing wrong in order to preserve the collective? Or do you sacrifice the collective in order to preserve the individual who's innocent? It kind of, I mean, it goes back to that conflict that I think the series is kind of based on between collectivism and individualism, where they ultimately choose to sacrifice the individual, but it's not like a predetermined decision. Like, Hajime and Sonya both show that they're willing to sacrifice themselves in order to save Chiake or the rest of the group, right? Like, Sonya offers for everyone to vote for her because she blames herself for leading the group to the fire grenades, and Hajime is just shown to be very unwilling to vote for Chiake until she actually very much pleads for it, right? And the game's ending as well is also just a choice of whether to preserve one's own self and return to living a normal life in the real world that also dooms society, because Junko's going to take over the bodies of the dead and get to do all kinds of, wacky shenanigans in the real world that's going to cause a lot of suffering. Or do you sacrifice yourself and stay in the machine and live in limbo? Once again, do you choose to preserve your own life at the expense of society, or do you save society and doom yourself? AI Junko is shown to still believe that in this innate selfishness of people, and 100% expects the Danganronpa 2 crew to choose to save themselves at the expense of society, but she still gives them the option. It's not like they get to the end and the only thing they can do is press the button to return back to the normal world and screw everything over, because that's not her goal. Her goal has never been, just wanton death and destruction. She likes to give people the option to choose their own doom, so to speak, I guess, is maybe one way to phrase it. I don't know. What seems to be interesting to her is when people embrace her ideology and worldview of their own volition. Maybe she'll stack the deck in order for them to make the decision she wants to happen, but almost never do you see Junko forcing anyone to do anything, right? And even Ultra Despair Girls kind of has the same idea in it, where choice is important for two main reasons, right? The first half of the game is kind of dominated by the question of whether or not Komaru should try to escape. And this, all comes to a head with the fight scene with Toko at the secret entrance, where the question is asked, should Komaru choose to preserve her own life and leave the city? In this case, city is kind of a metaphor for society as a whole, behind, or should she risk her own life and try and save the city and society? She ultimately ends up making the decision to, because she values her friendship with Toko, that she doesn't want to just choose herself, she wants to choose Toko and the rest of the city and kind of society as a whole, because she can't survive alone. She doesn't see value in living alone anymore, because she's kind of spent so much time at the start of the game completely isolated. It kind of is implied that that's maybe why she has such a appreciation for being able to work together with someone, and that kind of causes her to have that resolve to risk her life for the sake of strangers and society, right? And the game itself ends in a choice, just much like Danganronpa 1 and 2. The final choice of whether or not Komaru should sacrifice the adults of Towa City in order to prevent the tragedy from picking back up again, or should she save the adults by killing the children and ensure that a bigger and more dangerous conflict will break out? Monika wants Komaru to kill the children. At any time before the game ended, Monika could have pressed the button, killed all the children, right? But she doesn't, because she wants to offer Komaru that decision. She wants to force Komaru to make that choice to kill all these innocent children. It's never forced on Komaru. She stacks the deck to influence and manipulate Komaru by showing her dead parents right as she resists. But once again, when Komaru kind of initially makes the decision to break the controller before Toko jumps in, she made that decision of her own free will. She's not forced to do anything, right? And that's why the Despair arc bothers me so much. Because essentially, the point of the Despair arc was to answer two questions. One, how did the Danganronpa 2 crew get corrupted? And why, how, the process in which that happened? That's the main point And the secondary point is to just kind of give extra insight into how Hope's Peak collapsed and the tragedy kicked off. Now, the reason why the ultimate despair revelation at the end of Danganronpa 2 is so good is because, I mean, it's shocking, right? You're like, these characters all seem like innately reasonable people, except Nagito, who's crazy, and I love him. And Mikan, also crazy, don't love her. So you're confused as to like, well, how did these all, seemingly well-adjusted people, at least at the start of the game, I mean, everyone kind of goes a little crazy as it goes on, just due to the situation they're in, but these innately reasonable people become insane and merciless like they're depicted when the ultimate despair revelation happens. That's a really interesting question that the despair arc kind of promises to answer. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't really answer that, even though Danganronpa 2 provided a lot of groundwork for how you could explain this. Even though it seemed improbable, every character in Danganronpa 2 had some sort of flaw, insecurity, or trauma that could have been exploited, right? Like, I don't know every character's backstory per se, because I haven't seen all of the free time events, but based on the characters that I do know, having played the game or having been told about some of the characters, like, Kazuichi has his insecurity and trust issues, Fuyuhiko has the death of his sister, plus he has some own insecurities and misgivings about his role in the Yakuza that could have been exploited. Peko has that brainwashed, undying loyalty to Fuyuhiko, so get Fuyuhiko, you get her. Sonya, I don't really know, I never did her free time events, but her being kind of a foreigner in an unknown country could have maybe been exploited. Not Sayaka. Hiyoko and Mikan both have like abuse in their past that could have been exploited. Hajime, of course, has his insecurity and he kind of ends up corrupting himself due to his own flaws. So like all these characters, there are plausible explanations. There are like threads you could see that could be pulled on, so you could see how they could have been corrupted like naturally by Junko, right? And you expect to see that in the despair arc, and you don't. Instead, what you get is, no, they were always just good people, but they watched a video and then they became mass murderers. That is so uninteresting, boring, and bland as an explanation, which that's bad enough in itself. But the reason it's so bad is because you expect to see them make that choice to embrace despair. Because, as I just went over, choice is huge in all three of the games. Time and time again, Junko and, Monica as the Junko stand-in always offer a choice of what to do. You're never forced. It doesn't seem like that fits in her MO to just force people to be evil. She wants people to choose to be evil and do what she wants. So the explanation being that, oh, she just corrupted the world by showing a video, a scientifical magic MacGuffin that comes out of fucking nowhere, is so bad. And I'm actually getting mad now that I'm thinking about it more. Like, it's like a betrayal of everything the series kind of stood for, and what makes the series interesting, right? Like, the interesting aspect of the series is to see these characters make morally bad decisions and the explanations for how they get forced into doing this, right? And whether or not people will choose to themselves over the group, or will people choose to sacrifice themselves and put their own lives in jeopardy to ensure that, strangers will come out the other side with them, right? And so just making it be, oh, they saw a video, now they're evil and love Junko, is just, it's not good. Instead, what this arc should have been is it should have been about Junko going around and manipulating each character, finding their weaknesses, and kind of pulling on those threads and corrupting them naturally, which is what you expect to see, right? Like which would kind of explain the fanatical devotion to Junko, because Junko is the one who personally came in and got them to see this different worldview, right? It's why, and I mean, there was so much potential to do this, right? With like a Fuyuhiko's sister's death, where that could have been this like inciting incident that sets the class against each other, and then there's divides and division, and they're no longer this cohesive whole, and then Junko's able to slide into DMs and slowly start messing with people. That would have been so much more interesting than you get to like episode 8 and they're like, ah shit, we haven't really worked on this corrupting anybody yet. Video? Okay, video. It goes beyond just being a lazy piece of storytelling, because it's like it spits in the face of the idea of people choosing to embrace despair, and it goes against Junko's established MO, right? Instead of exploring that kind of interesting question of how normal individuals can be seduced by evil and have their flaws and insecurities exploited so that they're manipulated, the anime just has them fall victim to a scientific MacGuffin. It's never really explained at all. It just kind of shows up and he's like, oh, I make the ultimate anime. Look at it. It's got tons of panty shots in it. And then, people are like, okay, I'm going to murder the world. I just... And the reason I think it's so bad is that since it's like the inciting event of the entire tragedy, right? Like it kind of stains the rest of at least Danganronpa 2 in a way, because it also kind of undercuts one of the most interesting questions of Danganronpa 2, which one of the things that I thought was really cool, or one of the kind of interesting philosophical questions Danganronpa 2 asks at the end after the ultimate despair reveal, is that so the Neo World program, it offers a way to completely rehabilitate people. Even the most heinous of individuals, no matter what crimes they've committed, we can rehabilitate them, and more than that, we can ensure that they're going to spend the rest of their lives working for the good of society. And the question is never directly asked by the game, but it kind of implicitly asks the question of you, well, if we had a way to completely rehabilitate people in this way, and actually prove, or like ensure they're going to work to better society, like, would we use it? Like, can someone commit crimes so awful that even if we ensure they're never going to harm again, and will work to better the world, that should they be forgiven? Like, how much does forgiveness go? Like, how gracious should society be? Or how forgiving should society be? That's kind of the implicit question asked by the Neo World program, because in Danganronpa 2, it's, implied that the Danganronpa Ultimate Despairs are guilty, right? They committed crimes of their own volition. They chose to fall into darkness and commit all the mass murder and destruction that is attributed to them. But instead, making them unwilling victims of brainwashing, it absolves them of any and all guilt and kind of destroys this interesting question of, like, whether we should have even rehabilitated them in the first place. There's no moral gray in the situation. It's obviously yes. They had no choice. They were essentially, like, in a way kind of killed and turned... I mean, I kind of said this in the anime commentary videos, but it's almost like they were killed and turned into zombies. They stopped being the same people after they watched the video, right? They cannot be held accountable for anything they did. And that's another reason why the brainwashing is bad, because that's such a cool philosophical question of how far does rehabilitation go? Like, is there a crime so bad that society should never forgive it? Because, when it comes to the justice system, I mean, part of it is rehabilitation, but part of it's punishment, right? Like, even if you could assure that these people, or ensure that these people will never commit a crime again, and will, walk old ladies across the street. Like, if they committed such heinous crimes, like, it's a hard question of whether they should be forgiven or not. And another problem with the brainwashing is it also provides too easy solution to the other main question that still remained in about the tragedy, which is like, okay, we know how Hope's Peak got corrupted and destroyed, right? But why did this spread worldwide? Why did a weird high school in Japan having a riot where a bunch of people died cause countries all around the world to disintegrate? And the answer being, there was a lot of people saw a video and then they got real mad, is bad. It's real bad. Especially considering Ultra Despair Girls even kind of went out of their way to set up, like, the groundwork for a natural explanation of how society can kind of turn bloody when put in desperate situations, right? By seeing how aggressive the adults are about killing children. Like, even though the children are, like, innocent, right? Like, even after it's revealed the children are innocent, the adults are still want blood, right? So, it's like, it just, basically, the reason the Despair arc is bad, and the brainwashing aspect is bad, is because it dodges the central important questions it was supposed to answer, and instead provides just weak, half-assed answers that are just not compelling and interesting, which is not in the vein of the series as a whole. Like, basically, to sum things up in finality, instead of introducing some new thing to explain the questions of the tragedy, the anime should have built on the groundwork established by the games and worked from there. We should have seen how each character was corrupted. We should have seen something about like how Junko was able to bring the tragedy worldwide, and it shouldn't have been a frickin' anime video. It just... I mean, granted, I know it's not anime, it was a video of people killing each other, but it's just, I don't like it. It's bad, and you can't change my mind. So, closing thoughts. We're gonna talk a little bit about, I mean, the anime in general, but also just the entire Hope's Peak saga. This is going to be a little bit less scripted than the rest. I don't really have as much written here, so we're just going to kind of free flow it for a little bit to wrap things up. I have no clue how long we are into the video, because unlike my other like LP I mean, I don't know if I'm going to brand this as an LP Reflections, but as opposed to my other kind of one-man podcast videos, I haven't recorded this all in one shot. I've been kind of like stopping and pausing every once in a while as we get to like ends of certain sections, and I'm going to splice it all together. I even actually recorded one part of this for like 13 minutes, and my mic was muted the entire time, and secretly recorded it, or redid it real quick. But just to give a little insight into the production. Hopefully that won't be super obvious, but we'll see how well I'm able to splice together the audio. But yeah, so overall, I think Future is good. Future is really good. There's a couple missteps here and there, but overall, Future Arc provides a nice end to the series and a capstone on the entire saga. Some missteps here and there, and I think it could have been served better by a longer runtime or better using what little time it had. Or, honestly, it should have just been another visual novel. I don't think it being an anime really gave any benefits over it being a visual novel. Because, I mean, really the only thing the anime did that they couldn't have done in the visual novel is, like, they did some fight scenes, which are... And I guess, like, some of the, like, the murder sequence in the Student Council, like, that was more visceral, being fully animated, but... I really think it would have just worked better as a visual novel still, because you would have had extra time to actually offer interesting explanations for stuff, especially for Despair Arc. Because, I mean, I feel like a lot of it is just that they ran out of time in Despair Arc, and they had to come up with a half-assed explanation at the end. Because they realized they didn't have enough time to truly show every character getting corrupted naturally. Like, I guess I'll give them some benefit in that regard. I still think it's bad, but I can almost understand why it's bad. But... And then, so that's Future. Future, good. Me like Future. Despair, bad. It just doesn't really achieve its goal for why it exists. No interesting answers to the remaining questions about the tragedy. The only real strong point of the arc, and it is a good strong point, Hajime's transformation, the extra explanation of like Chiake's role in that, and Chiake's role as like the group's center and like cohesive like centerpiece for everyone, as well as her death scene is, you know, very, very well done, a very impactful moment. But everything else is kind of bad, and I don't like it. The brainwashing, it goes against the entire thematic premise, what I see as the main theme of the game, and misstep after misstep in execution in the Despair arc, it just kind of like, in a way, sours the entire series a little bit. Like, it makes parts of maybe really just Danganronpa 2 a little bit worse in retrospect, just by kind of destroying that interesting aspect at the end of like, you know, you think differently about these characters now because you're like, wow, how could they choose to do this? And then with the knowledge that, oh, actually, they never chose to do anything. They were just, like, 100% taken advantage of with literally no other option. It's less compelling in my mind. And a Hope arc represents a somewhat rushed and flawed conclusion to the saga, but nevertheless, it's still satisfying and enjoyable. The series' ideals and themes would have probably been better demonstrated with a more somber ending wherein Kyoko truly died, and Makoto and the others had to carry on with her memory while working to rebuild the world, but it's still, like, I enjoyed it, right? And for all the negative things I kind of have said about the anime, after I finished it, like last week, I did spend, like, the rest of the day kind of thinking about it, right? And the only reason I even went to such length talking about why I dislike Despair is because I think it could have been so much better and I respect the series, right? Like, I really do truly enjoy these games. I've gotten like a couple comments from various people throughout, mainly the Danganronpa 1 Let's Play, about saying that like I was too harsh on the game or like I didn't like it or I complained too much, which I just want to say, like, I mean, I do really like the game, right? The only reason I'm ever critical of something is because I believe it can do better, right? Like, if something's just bad, I'm not, you know, I usually don't say anything, in all honesty. Like, if something's just, like, if I think something is just completely bad, I don't really, like, I only go into this much detail of talking about critique because I think it could have been better. And that's kind of how I was with like Danganronpa 1, with like how I wasn't, at the time, I do like the ending more and more as time goes on, but initially I wasn't a huge fan of the conclusion of Danganronpa 1. And that's why I kind of went to such length to try and talk about how I think the ending should have been done, because I respect the series, right? I respect it enough to engage it critically, I suppose, is the way I would phrase it. But yeah, this was kind of a fun video to do. I don't know if it really made any sense. It's slightly more structured than my normal, like, one-man podcast videos, but overall, I mean, I really liked the Hope's Peak Saga and everything. Danganronpa 1 and 2 are great. Even Ultra Despair Girls is really good. It actually does some aspects better than the main two games. Like, the chemistry between Toko and Komaru was incredibly well done, and it actually did, like, kind of, like, that was a more natural friendship than any of the other relationships in the main two games. But I just, like, I really liked it. Even though Despair Arc is bad. Even despite Despair Arc being really bad, I still really enjoyed it. Trying to think if there's any other final things to say. As far as Danganronpa 3, like, you know, V3, whatever the hell it's called, we will play it somewhat soon. I think the plan is to finish Phoenix Wright, which I still haven't finished recording yet. I'll record the finale of that probably Monday. Or, like, record the last little bit Monday. I meant to record it today, but this video ended up taking, like, no joke, like, it's probably been, like, 7 hours. Like, recording plus writing the bullet points and then kind of, like, running through the script, well, not really the script, but the bullet points ahead of time. It's probably been about, like, 7 hours today, so I didn't record anything. Basically just spent my entire day on this video. So, finish that up, and I think I plan to just go ahead and do Phoenix Wright 2 immediately after, and then when we finish Phoenix Wright 2, I want to go back to Danganronpa and do Danganronpa 3. And then we can kind of do some fun videos about that, like talking about the entire, like all the mainline games and, you know, ranking them and doing like character stuff. And I still really want to do a comparison video between this series and Zero Escape, but I would also need to do a Let's Play of Zero Time Dilemma before I could do that. But yeah, that's also another like fun video I want to do in the future. But I think that's everything I've got to say. I don't know how much of it made any sense, but if anything didn't make any sense, I can try and explain it in a comment, or you can just tell me I'm wrong. That'll be fun too. I'm Extra Cheesy 87. Stay tuned for the next Let's Play, and bye guys.